Lieutenant Colonel Lincoln S. Farish here. Let's talk legitimacy. Now remember, these are my ideas. They're not endorsed by DoD, the U.S. Army, USCAPOC, or SWCC. Legitimacy. What is it? How does it work? Why does it pertain to us? All right, legitimate. The definition is according to law. And so there's not a non-circular definition of legitimate when it comes to politics. Legitimate is subjective. It's based on individual perceptions. It's culturally defined. What's legitimate one place is not legitimate somewhere else. And it's always in flux. It's always moving about. It's a perception. It's not a hard and fast metric. However, unlike stability, legitimacy is binary. Either something is legitimate or it is not. All right, so the Army's got a definition of legitimacy. You can find it in ADP 3-07, stability. Legitimacy is a condition based on the perception by specific audience of the legality, morality, and rightness of a set of actions and of the propriety of the authority of the individuals or organizations in taking them. Not a bad definition. All right, so legitimacy during stabilization, there's two aspects. One is the legitimacy of the host nation government. If the populace doesn't trust the host nation government, our attempts to help are only going to be seen as further propping them up. Now, who sees that mostly is the local populace. So it's the local populace. That's one audience. The other part of legitimacy, the other aspect, is the mission, which is derived from four factors: the mandate, the manner, consent, and expectations. Now, that is also the local populace, but it is also the U.S. and the international community. As with most things in civil affairs, local is better. Local legitimacy is better. The perceived effectiveness, fairness, or justness of the government, local, including distribution of national wealth, economic opportunities, dispute resolution is an important one, can vary from place to place or social group to social group. If the local government is seen as legitimate, that will make your job much easier. Now, when legitimacy is negative, the perception can drive instability. Why should I help the government build this bridge? Now, when it's positive, it can become legitimacy can be a resiliency factor and it can help foster stability. So you need to recognize legitimacy, understand where it comes from, how it's derived, and most importantly, how to measure it. All right, so again, back to, you're still dealing with the local populace. And the legitimacy of a mission is sensitive to perceptions. Facts are important, but perceptions matter when it comes to legitimacy. Legitimacy and host nation ownership depend on local civilians supporting and participating in the process that compose the mission. If you decide to build a bridge in someone's holy ground or in a place where no one can use it, you are not going to be building legitimacy. So the authority of the state, intervening forces, or intervening organizations depend on the successful amalgamation and interplay of four factors: the mandate, manner, consent, and expectations. All of those combined help with legitimacy. And we'll see here in the next slide. All right, so the mandate. The mandate is basically your authority to do something, or the perceived authority to do something. It's perceived legitimacy that establishes the intervening authority and the state authority of the host nation, whether it's through principles of universal suffrage or recognized and accepted caste or tribal model. So remember, the perception of your actions being legitimate is very focused on the audience who is viewing it. And that's going to vary from group to group. So the mandate or authority that establishes a mission often determines the initial perceptions of legitimacy. Multilateral missions with a broad approval have a higher degree of legitimacy than unilateral missions, to an extent. Obviously, if someone's traditional enemies are part of your multilateral coalition, there's going to be a problem. Manner. How you do things makes a difference. The way in which those exercising a mandate conduct themselves both individually and collectively. Now, this can build legitimacy as the operation progresses. If you do what you say and you do it respectfully, people will be more well received to you doing it. Highly professional forces are disciplined, trained, and culturally aware. That's where we become very important. For military forces, a clearly defined commander's intent and mission statement establishes the initial focus that drives the long-term legitimacy of a mission. If you come to an area and you say, we're here to build a bridge, and when we're done building the bridge, we're done, we're leaving, and people will be more inclined to trust you and not get in the way, even possibly be helpful. If you say, we're here to establish, peace and prosperity for all eternity, people are going to be a little wary of what you're doing and how long you're going to be there. Military forces also make every effort to minimize harm to civilians. When harm to civilians does occur, they address it in a culturally appropriate way. Now, again, not just minimize harm to civilians, minimize harm to civilian infrastructure and local resources. If you go and crush someone's chicken farm, they are not going to be very well pleased with you. If you then pay restitution for that, you will ameliorate the situation and at least come out neutral. Consent is the extent to which factions and others comply or resist with the authority. If they consent, they're at least neutral. If they don't consent, they can be feeding an insurgency or just making life really, really difficult. Now, consent ranges from active resistance through unwilling compliance to freely given support. All right? Consent is essential to the legitimacy of a mission. If you do not have the consent of the local populace, the legitimacy of that mission will be perceived as very, very low. No mission is perceived as legitimate without the full consent of the host nation or an international recognized mandate. So, not only do you need the full consent of the host nation, you need the consent at some level of the local populace that you're interacting with. Locals rarely perceive unilateral missions to impose regime change as legitimate, however well-intentioned they are. I'm doing this for your own good. No one ever wants to hear that. All right, so expectations. Managed or met, they're the final arbiter of legitimacy. Realistic, consistent, and achievable expectations. We are here to build a bridge. In terms of goals, time, and resources, help ensure legitimacy during a lengthy operation. We're here for as long as we need to put in electricity, to build a well. That's what we're here to do. If you explain it and explain it well, people will be far more understanding. Progress is a measure of expectations and an indirect determinant of trust. Missions that do not achieve a degree of progress consistent with expectations inevitably erode the trust of the host nation. So, if you don't do what you say you're going to do, it's going to be far more difficult for the next guy to be able to accomplish their mission. It may even be difficult for you to accomplish your mission. Trust is number one. Without the trust of the people, the legitimacy of any mission decreases and the likelihood of mission failure increases. So again, just to reinforce, a mission that is seen as illegitimate is in danger of not being completed. Actions and perceptions in different sectors have impacts on your AO. So if you're doing everything right, but someone is playing around in the next sector over, that can bleed over into your AO. You've got to be prepared to deal with that. So the question becomes, how do you measure this stuff? How do you measure a nebulous action perception of the populace? And how do you incorporate that up into what hire's asking for? And is it a measure of performance or a measure of effectiveness? I would say legitimacy is a measure of effectiveness. It's based on your performance, but it's a measure of effectiveness. The MPICE here will give you a really good series of questions and concepts that you can use to help create a metrics framework so that you can measure the perceived legitimacy of what's going on in your AO. Legitimacy. It's a nebulous concept. It's difficult to describe, easy to comprehend. You recognize it when you see it. It's also difficult to measure. Use the MPICE. You can get indirect measurements of it that will help explain what's going on and why it's going on, and whether or not more attention needs to be paid to more socio-political issues rather than direct combat. That will help you be able to inform the combatant commander to help him meet his mission intent. So, loss of legitimacy could mean a potential loss of the mission. Keep that in mind, understand it, and you'll do well. As always, a book recommendation. To Win Hearts and Minds by Colonel Terry Mitchell, Civil Affairs Officer, one of ours. He came in about the end of Vietnam, left in about 06, 08, went to all the interesting spots, Mogadishu, Bosnia, Desert Storm, Desert Shield, and the invasion of Iraq. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to email me or just put the comments down below.